Welcome to Destigmatizing Justice, a podcast by the Center for African Justice, Peace and Human Rights, a non-profit foundation based in The Hague, Netherlands. I am Daniela, and together with my colleague Sanjana, we are here to discuss the often overlooked issue of sexual violence against men in conflict zones. At the Center for African Justice, we focus on promoting justice, peace and human rights through education, research and advocacy. Our sexual violence team specifically addresses conflict-related sexual violence against men, seeking to raise awareness and break the stigma surrounding this issue. Today, we are honored to have here with us Professor Robert Omoken from Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto, Japan. He is an expert in international relations and the author of the insightful article, Male-Directed Sexual Violence in Conflict, a Challenge for Gender Studies. Join us as we explore this topic with Professor Omoken, aiming to break down barriers through raising awareness and opening up the conversation. Welcome to our podcast.
We'd love for you to start with introducing yourself a bit, telling us a bit about your work.
Yes, thanks very much for the opportunity to reflect on these important issues. So I'm Robert Omokwan and I teach in a College of International Relations in Kyoto. I've been in Japan for many years, and my doctorate was on the situation for sexual minorities and discrimination against people because of their sexual identity. And I have done research mainly on gender issues and masculinities issues, and more recently on campaigns against sexual abuse and sexual harassment, the success or lack of success of the Me Too movement in Japan and elsewhere. So those are my research interests, and my research interest that's relevant here this evening is male-directed sexual violence. And I became interested in that because I became a member of a Department of International Relations, and I had been focusing on gender issues and sexual minorities and homophobia, masculinities. But I also wanted to explore some area had some implications for those issues, some connections, but was relevant in the field of global politics and global society, because the students are international studies and global studies students. So that's why I became interested in this area, and particularly as well in the field of conflict zones where sexual violence is happening. But I'm not an expert. I can give a layperson's reflections on what I think can make sense, let's say, to the average student in a classroom. And that's why I don't have a very sophisticated vocabulary to talk about it. I don't have any specialized research, but I think I can hopefully offer some reflections on what can seem meaningful to the average student based on my limited experience.
So we read this one article of yours that drew us to contact you. Basically, that this article was called Male-Directed Sexual Violence and Conflict, a Challenge for Gender Studies. Can you tell us a bit more about your article and what kind of research you conducted in that, and what drew you to this topic in the first place? Did you feel like there was something missing in existing research?
I'm sure there are gaps, but for me, the main, I guess, motivation was that I could make connections with the areas that I mentioned that are relevant for me and that would be relevant and interesting for my students. And we are, and I'm a language educator as well. My students often don't have English as their first language. So it also was interesting for me to focus on language. It's relevant in the way that we talk about sexual violence, the way we talk about its effects. It's relevant when we talk about things, for example, what's called counseling discourse, the way counselors interact with victims who have been traumatized by sexual violence. Um, so we found it very helpful and interesting. There were so many aspects of language and of um, politics and gender and um, the idea, I guess, that the personal is political is a foundational maxim, really, of feminism as well, which we will probably talk about later. But it's a very, very real example of where a personal experience is completely interlaced with political implications and the causes for a lot of sexual violence. And so, for all these very diverse reasons, um, I was motivated to become more involved in looking at um, male-directed sexual violence and conflict. And the specific focus is on invisibilization. That was just the theme by which we were able to um, conceptualize the whole topic. It's a very complex area. Many different strands are involved, and just to simplify it a little, we just try to frame it in that article and in the sessions I had with students to think about invisibilization, where social pressures, identity pressures make people feel that they no longer really count as as people. They no longer count as full members of society, and they actually actively feel they have to make themselves invisible. That's what they feel compelled to do. And we see it also a lot in the language, as we mentioned, in counseling situations where victims are not able to speak. But maybe most importantly, that victims have been made invisible in the whole literature of sexual violence and conflict. That it becomes clear if you read the literature that very often boys and men who have been victimized are just invisible. They're not being represented. They're not being represented. And just as a very a simple example, um, if you go online, you'll see a few months ago in February that there was an event organized at Georgetown University, Columbia University, high profile seminar. Hillary Clinton spoke and other experts, but it was entitled as an event to explore conflict related sexual violence, but actually they only referred to women and girls. And I think if you're just going to specifically look at women's experience, that should be in the title, because I think it's misleading if you say this is a seminar on conflict related sexual violence and you only speak about women and girls. You reinforce the myth that only women and girls are victims. But we know that the reality is very different. And if you pick up a book like Heinemann's one on sexual violence in conflict, the whole history of it, she's the editor of the collection, but you go to the index and there's no reference to male victims. Absolutely nothing. So if you pick up that book and you think at the end of it, now I understand the history of um, sexual violence in conflict. But in reality, you don't have the full picture, because very often, as well as all of the female victims, there are also male victims. And those victims have been made invisible. The language um, of the research studies, the language of international institutions and courts and NGOs and United Nations agencies that have investigated it very often don't make any reference to the experience of men and boys. So I think for us it was helpful just to use that metaphor of invisibilization as a way to cover a range of relevant aspects.
I think that what you said, that language is a very powerful tool when we are talking about including and excluding certain group of people. It's very good point, and that made me think of a question that you raised in your article, which is basically the idea that if more attention is given to male survivors of sexual violence in conflict context, then is that a backlash against the gains that were made by female survivors? And I would like to ask you if you can reflect a bit on that.
Sure, it's a very good question, and I can understand why many people, especially feminist activists, are very worried that this could be part of a backlash just to curtail women's empowerment and lessen it. And it is true that the resources that are being provided for victims of sexual violence in conflict zones already isn't enough. It should be more, and there is a danger that if we recognize another set of victims, that the the budgets might be less for female victims. But our argument would be, I think anyone who has engaged with these issues, it should be that we're spending way too much money already on militarization, trillions, literally trillions of dollars on military budgets every year. And the obligation that's upon us, if we do really form an international humanitarian community, then there's an obligation to make sure all the resources necessary are being provided to help all victims, and we're not going to deprive any victims of the the um, the comprehensive support that they require. But it's understandable that people have these concerns, but it should not be a zero sum game whereby if we reduce attention or support for female victims and start giving it to men and boys also, that means yes, it's going to be really negative and um, have negative consequences for female victims. There's no reason why that should be the case. We should really just focus on increasing people's awareness and their sense of empathy and their commitment to providing resources. And as I said, I think it's possible if we reduce, let's say, military budgets, and that would also have a very positive effect in just reducing the amount of weapons that are being produced that end up in Central Africa, in the Middle East, in parts of Asia that are awash with weapons, cheap weapons. They're basically proliferated and easily available. And you can imagine how a young person feels this sense of power when they're given a weapon. It's placed in their hands. All they have experienced previously was poverty and deprivation and difficulties. But getting weapons into their hands can make a person feel suddenly very powerful, and we all know what the horrendous effects are going to be. And so many conflicts are ongoing. We don't hear much about these conflicts, but they're ongoing all the time. They're in areas that are completely awash with weapons. So reducing the amount of weaponry that's out there makes complete sense. And that's another thing we can do very practically to increase resources that could be provided for all of the victims who are in need of vital help and resources.
I think you raised a lot of good points, and we have a lot of content now that we want to unpack with the questions. But I think before that, for our listeners who don't really know much about sexual violence in conflict zones, I wanted to ask you maybe if you could kind of conceptualize what sexual violence in conflict zones means and what it entails, and kind of how prevalent it can be or is in your knowledge, at least?
As I said, it's very limited knowledge because I'm not an expert in these areas. I'm just reflecting as someone who has tried to engage with the literature. But I think it's very important what you're saying. We should just think about what is sexual violence, and does it have another type of meaning in during a conflict, during military conflict, and um, how prevalent it is. Those are the three aspects I think we're thinking about. So, sexual violence, we should see it as another type of violence. I don't think we should see it as completely um, separate or unique. But it is true that every case of sexual violence is singular. Um, it should be understood on its own terms, and it's deserving of close examination. We shouldn't try to reduce all cases of sexual violence to the same kind of components, because there's so much complexity and so much singularity. But we do have to have a common vocabulary so we can understand sexual violence as the use of force that harms a person in terms of their sexual health, their sense of themselves as sexual beings in some way, because their genitalia or their sexual parts of the body are being violated, or they're being made to engage in acts that are sexualized, just being forced to look at acts of sexual abuse or sexual torture. That's sexual violence. Um, And it's very important the way that sexual violence is classified and defined, because in that will make all the difference when it comes to a court case where somebody is seeking justice. That will make all the difference when agencies are being given resources to help victims. So if your definition of sexual violence is something that just happens to women and girls, well, that means that it's possible many victims are going to be um, marginalized or made invisible. Just a very quick statistic: in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the studies indicated that in more recent conflicts, 30% of the um, female victims had experienced sexual violence. 22% were men, and it's not a huge difference. It's an indicator that it may be the case that in many um, conflict areas, the percentages are much bigger than we realize. So um, it's very important that we acknowledge that sexual violence is deeply traumatic, that it has long-term effects. Physical wounds can heal more quickly than these psychological wounds, and that has big implications for peace, for reconciliation. If you want to transform a conflict zone into a peacekeeping zone, and then into a peaceful zone with positive peace, as in everyone feels that their dignity is respected, that they can live with their neighbors. Well, that reconciliation doesn't happen if a person is still carrying very deep psychological wounds. And that is what happens after sexual violence causes that kind of trauma. Very often it causes profound mental health issues and um, what's called suicidal ideation. So it's very, very difficult for villages and small communities to reconstruct themselves after um, a period of sustained military conflict. If you still have many members of the community who have very deep wounds, or who have been made to feel that they can't speak about it, that they have to remain silent. And that very often is the case for male victims. So that would be my reflection on what sexual violence is, what it can mean in areas of conflict, and I would just echo what so many others have said, is that male-directed sexual violence and conflict is much more prevalent than was previously understood. And in a way, you could say that what was the case for women for centuries now has to be understood as relevant also for male victims, because for centuries the rape of women during war was not even seen as a war crime. It wasn't seen as an issue we need to discuss and try to grapple with. It was just seen as a corollary of war. And if you want, we could go into that, but I think it's been well documented. And there were the myths about rape that applied to women and kept women in the shadows and made it difficult for women to come forward as victims. That changed over a certain period. In the second half of the 20th century, it became possible for female victims of sexual violence to come forward in conflict areas and in peacetime social sites. But for men, for male victims, those conditions still exist. The rape myths about men are still very prevalent. This is something that Chris Dolan has written about and spoken about in the Refugee Law Project in Uganda. I'm sure you're probably familiar with his work. Very valuable work, but when he explains it, he speaks about male rape myths. And I think that these myths have to be undone completely. I think they have been undone to a large extent. They don't um, they don't impoverish women's lives the way they used to, but they do really impoverish the lives of men and boys who feel they can't come forward and speak out and seek justice because they live in a society or community where those male rape myths are very deeply embedded in people's thinking about what constitutes a real man, and they're deprived of any kind of decent existence and quality of life because of that reality.
Um, yeah, and speaking of um, specifically male-directed sexual violence, you also talked about how the numbers really aren't that different if you look at it, right? So in terms of male-directed sexual violence, what kind of specific challenges do you think you also touched on this in your previous answer, but what are the specific challenges in terms of stigma or cultural beliefs and norms or masculinity? You said something also about invisibility that you wrote about in your work. So what kind of challenges you think male survivors have coming forward and addressing what's going on with themselves and their society? And also in terms of the data that you're mentioning, how reliable do you think these data sets or statistics are? And because what we struggle with a lot at our organization is finding a lot of content or reliable data about specifically male-directed sexual violence. And I believe that there is actually quite a shortage of it in terms of numbers. So I wanted to ask you, is there data and is it reliable, firstly, and about specific challenges as well?
Yes, I think it's probably the case that it's very difficult yet to obtain reliable data, and that won't change until there are profound changes in society. Um, what I think what has to begin what really begins the process of change, and this is the big challenge, is that people become aware of the issue and then they demand change. And I would think of it in a different context. Let's say in my home country in Ireland, that at a certain point, people said, we want to know the truth. How many priests were abusing um, young men or any other victims? And it turned out that if you actually provided the resources to research it, you would find out that it was very prevalent. So it begins, I think, with people wanting to know the truth about the extent of the abuse and not being satisfied with easy answers. So in peacetime zones, very often we know now that there's a lot of sexual abuse of male victims. It could be in churches, it might be in prisons or correctional facilities, or in hazing rituals in military organizations. So that eagerness to acknowledge the truth and desire to help the victims, all the victims, needs to be extended to all areas and including to conflict zones. Now, those conflict zones very often have very traditional gender structures, and their whole hierarchies are very gendered in terms of men being superior to women. And they also tend often to be very homophobic in that um, homosexual acts are criminalized. So it makes it extremely difficult for men to come forward and say that they are victims of sexual violence. I think that's the huge challenge. It's that the societies themselves are societies very often where people don't want to know the truth because it's too unpalatable. If you live in a society where a man is supposed to be like a warrior, a leader, his body is an impenetrable, his body is something like a weapon. And it's too psychologically threatening if you then are going to say that no, a large number of men have become victims. And they themselves, those victims, know it's very difficult for them to function then in society. Number one, they're worried that people think that they might have consented in some way to the same-sex acts that they were forced to participate in. Well, how do you prove to someone that you in no way elicited that, you in no way drew it upon yourself? So being tarred with the brush of homosexuality is a huge factor, and just the gendered, hierarchical, patriarchal context that tells a man to be a real man, you always have to show that you are the powerful one, that you are more powerful than women, because that's the way society is supposed to be structured. So when we use the term hegemonic masculinity, which you've probably heard about, and there's many ways to think about it, but hegemonic masculinity basically creates a whole gender ideology and set of beliefs in society where to be a real man, to be recognized as a real man, you have to engage in displays of power over women and engage in displays of power over weak men. And I'm using quotation marks here to mean that what do we mean by weak men? Unfortunately, in conflict zones, soldiers, terrorists, people of violence know that this is a very simple way to terrorize a population and to make men feel that they no longer have the ability to count because others have displayed power over them as if they were women. As Susan Brown Miller famously said, when men are raped, they are raped as women. And I think it's worth reflecting on that. Maybe we can in our conversation a bit more, but just to go back to your question, I think basically these are the most difficult challenges to deal with. How do you change the way an entire society thinks about gender relations? What makes a real man a real woman? And you may have seen reports in Uganda where the men who come forward and go to a hospital perhaps and are told by medical personnel, you don't belong here, and men can't be raped, or they are told by their own wives or female partners, how can you be my husband anymore if that happened to you? How can you be a father to our children? So I think for you and I, we're thinking, how can people be so callous? How can they show such a lack of empathy and understanding to a male victim? But we have to understand that in that particular society and that culture, with the traditions of masculinity and femininity that have been there for centuries, it's not possible just to change everything overnight. So we have to have a great deal of patience and stamina to stick with it. People like Chris Dolan in um, Uganda with Refugee Law Project, and people in Kivu and the Congo, and people everywhere. I think an organization like Just Detention International, which specifically deals with um, sexual violence in prisons, and that's just prisons in the United States, but they have such a difficult job just trying to help all those prisoners, and it's mainly male prisoners who find it so difficult to come out of the shadows and seek the help that they need. But it's not just a problem in conflict zones or zones with traditional gender or homophobic discourses there. It's prevalent everywhere, and yeah, we need of um, a lot of patience, I think, and um, hard work if we can really rise to the challenge. So I have great admiration for the people who are doing that. I'm just someone who's an educator. I try to raise awareness among my students and perhaps anyone who has read an article I might have written. But it's an extremely challenging, difficult task that so many activists are facing.
Regarding the fact that you mentioned how survivors often they feel stripped of this social status of men in their societies. This is also something that comes a lot in our research at the center. And I think you mentioned at the beginning something very important, that sexual violence is harm against someone's sense of being. And in relation to that, I was wondering, how do you see that an inclusive approach to feminism can overcome some of these challenges that we talked about in regarding of how we conceptualize masculinity and gender hierarchy?
So if we think specifically about an inclusive feminism, a feminism that um, would see this as very helpful and relevant to try to focus on male victims of sexual violence, along with a focus which has to be there for female victims. So, of course, yeah, thanks for the question. It's um, an important one as well. And I know that um, it's something that activists have to uh, deal with. For example, Chris Dolan, when he tried to organize a seminar in a university in the UK a few years ago, he spoke about the reaction of some of his colleagues, or I think previous colleagues, who were saying, "Really, you're trying to tell us this is a feminist issue?" Um, so it's a real live issue, and I guess maybe my starting point would be uh, to make people aware that there's a lot of literature out there that says feminism should be inclusive. Um, Claire Cohen, for example, a British criminologist, her book is entitled Male Rape is a Feminist Issue. So even though it's a kind of a shock to hear that title, Male Rape is a Feminist Issue, but I think if nothing else, it would make a person stop on their tracks and think, okay, so maybe I was wrong if I thought feminism meant trying to help women have more empowered lives, helping women and girls to have the same rights and opportunities as men. Maybe I have to change the notion I have of feminism. Maybe feminism also means that um, men and boys sometimes are disempowered by uh, the gender ideology, that impoverishes women and girls and takes away their rights and opportunities. That can often be the case for men and boys as well. And there's lots of different ways in which that can apply. But we're talking specifically about sexual violence. And I think that if you ask feminists to engage with the literature, I think that they will begin to see that it doesn't make sense to exclude men or to feel threatened by the focus on male victims of sexual violence. Maybe by showing the literature that shows that the the psychological effects are just as horrendous for male victims. In fact, there's no evidence from any studies that would indicate the that the wounds are any less deep. There really is no evidence out there to indicate that. If you look at the long-term effects, mental health effects, and danger of suicide, then that becomes clear. So, as I mentioned before, what we could call a toxic masculinity that wants to control women and take away, have displays of power over women, that same masculinity wants to reduce certain men to the status of weak men or uncoded men or men who don't count anymore. And sexual violence is used as a way to do that. So it's a display of power over men to reduce them to the status of non-men and not truly human. But the way that's done is by stigmatizing men as somehow having been feminized. So that means it's a stigmatization of women. As Brownmiller said, men who are raped as women. It's totally based on a toxic, harmful notion of gender relations that places masculinity in a superior position to femininity. So I think if you engage with feminist thought and discourse with some of these ideas, I'm sure there are many other ways. I just can't think of them now, but those are the ones that spring to mind as most relevant to help um, make feminists aware that we should be more inclusive, and not only mentioning the insights of people like Chris Dolan, but of theorists like Cynthia Enloe in the area of international studies, who have spoken about this and written about it, that there's absolutely no reason to feel that feminism should exclude all engagement with male victims in this kind of discourse that we're trying to have here. That the opposite is the case. We're trying to create a society where femininity and masculinity are no longer used in this kind of toxic, harmful, hierarchical way, where just the value of the dignity of the human being and having a sense of empathy with every human being becomes, foundational in the way that we interact and try to organize our societies. So there's so much rich feminist literature out there. I mentioned Enloe, but I'm sure you're probably aware of many others. So I think that might be the best starting point. But if nothing else, if you just say, well, read Claire Cohen's book. Male rape is a feminist issue. She has a lot of data from legal areas and from popular culture to reinforce it, and that might be a starting point, perhaps.
I think we're slowly moving towards the end of our conversation with you here. And I'd like to pick up on a few points that you mentioned in this last answer. So you talked a bit about trauma, psychology, and kind of the impact that survivors have, not just females, but also males. And I read in your article also the kind of impact that this trauma has in terms of substance abuse and mental health. And I wanted to bring it up. What kind of impact do you think this trauma creates? I think you already touched on it a bit. And the second question to this is, and how can we as people or socially or organizationally through policy or programming, or if a mental health professional is listening to this podcast, how can we make a better trauma-informed care system for survivors of sexual violence, including that is an inclusive care system?
Yeah, I'm not an expert really on the psychology or the how to bring about an inclusive care system, but my reflection would be maybe just start off with something that I read in the Lancet about care for victims of violence after the conflict in Sri Lanka. So, in one study, I think the author was Patel, but they found that there was a group of men who had been interviewed in Sri Lanka post-conflict, and they spoke about what had happened to them, um, but never spoke about sexual violence. And that same group of men gained refugee status and were able to move to London in the UK, and they were able to gain access to counselors and to speak about their experiences and how to deal with post-traumatic stress disorder. 21% of them actually had been victims of sexual violence, and they had never spoken about it, even though they had been interviewed in Sri Lanka. So I think that shows us that it's extremely difficult for male victims in many contexts to speak about what has happened to them. But if the context is helpful and supportive, that they will. So it's really important that we make sure that the counselors are well trained, that they have the patience to really give the their clients time to speak about what they need to speak about. They need to be trained to recognize the signs of trauma that's been hidden, that's not been spoken about. And they need to recognize also that the language that's used might actually be an implicit call for help, but it's not going to be explicit. In the interviews, the person might speak about what they saw. I saw what happened to him. They'll speak about it in the third person. And the counselor, if they're trained well, will be able to bring that person to the point where they're able to say, well, actually, what I told you, it wasn't just what I saw happening to other people. That's what was happening to me. And it's very difficult for them to go on that journey where they reach that point psychologically, where they feel that they can speak about what they have undergone. So it's important that we, if we have any influence, that we make sure that the counselors and therapists and caregivers and medical personnel, all of the people who are going to interact with victims, of sexual violence, that all of those people are very empathetic and are well trained so that they are going to be able to help everyone, women and girls, men and boys, all of them, to be able to deal with their psychological wounds. So I'm not sure if that answered your question. Was there some other aspect there that we could mention?
I believe this is already extremely insightful and useful for us. So thank you so much for your reflections and for taking the time to help us be here today. I believe these are all the questions that we have prepared so far. If there is something else that you would like to add as a concluding remark or something that you would want the listeners to know, to take away specifically, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks so much. But just to finish off the interview, I'll just say that for me it was very enriching to find out that students can engage with this very difficult issue, even though, let's say, a typical student in Japan is so far removed from, um, the atrocities that are happening in a correction facility in El Salvador or um, in Eastern Congo, um, whatever it is. But um, human beings do have a capacity for empathy. And um, I think the challenge when we look at this issue is to have the not only the empathy, but the imagination to imagine a world where um, caring is as important as toughness. I'm paraphrasing Cynthia Enlow there, but just in a very simple way to conceptualize it, where caring is as important as toughness. In life, yeah, we all need toughness to get through difficult situations, but we have to prioritize caring and empathy and cooperation and these values just as much as we do toughness and resilience and fighting spirit. And I think what I have learned just from engaging with students is that they do have the capacity to understand that, to feel empathy for people who they might not have ever imagined feeling empathy for previously. But it is possible. And I think we all can understand that we would prefer to live in a world where there's much more empathy and help for one another, rather than always encoding um, the tough, the strong, and the dominant as what we value most in our world. So that's my final point.
I think that's a wonderful note to end this podcast episode. So thank you again for participating.
Thank you for tuning into Destigmatizing Justice. We hope today's episode sparked your interest and inspired you to act. Please share it with others and join the conversation on our social media platforms. Let's keep dismantling stigma and building a world where justice is genderless. Until next time, remember that awareness is the first step towards change.